Everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the Game Week 1 Midfielders cheat sheet. If you've never watched a cheat sheet series before, it's effectively a pretty detailed guide, I would like to say, on the positions in FPL, looking at every single price point and objectively considering whether they are extremely valuable at that sort of price point. So for people who are maybe jumping onto the series later into the season, it's a very good way to look for transfers for your certain players, especially when fixtures get a little bit worse, and particularly, for example, when things might change, right? For example, if let's say a player is no longer starting for a team, you kind of need to hop off a player as well, that kind of thing. From Game Week 1, we're recording now on the 23rd of July, and things will change. I'm sure transfers will come in. Our understanding of managers will change based on the preseason, and this cheat sheet will have a sort of final form before Game Week 1 starts, and you can refer to that later down the line. But I think it's helpful to create this video to set an initial expectation of players, particularly given that we had so much data from last season, and we have also, our thoughts on certain players and whether their role can be a little bit more expansive this season in the midfield position. Another thing I'll mention is in terms of the cheat sheet series, a lot of people have been asking, how do I consider fixtures? I tend to consider fixtures both in the short term and the medium term. So whilst you can only see 3 fixtures at any one time, I'm also taking into consideration game weeks 4, 5, 6, and so on. And as the series goes on and continues, I'll tend to look maybe 3 to 5 to even 8 game weeks at a time, but obviously a little bit more of a focused eye on the immediate fixtures, and then a little bit of less weightage, I suppose, applied to those later fixtures. And the same goes with when we start to see stats from the players in the current season, and we start to probably rely a little bit less on stats from the previous season. Another thing that's very important too in terms of building the cheat sheet is understanding that players are not just their underlying stats in terms of expected goals or expected assists, right? Some people are penalty takers, some people take free kicks, some people take corners. They might also perform certain actions that are very helpful to getting bonus points. And this season, as you can see, shots on target, quite important, fouls drawn as well, quite important. So definitely take into account all aspects of the rules in FPL and trying to create a cheat sheet from that. A lot of the data within this video has been provided by the Opta Stats feature within Fantasy Football Hub, so thank you so much for them for working with me this season. As a partner, I'll be using a lot of their data throughout the season and updating you guys as well with some of the 23-24 data to have a look at some other things like points projections, expected clean sheets, expected goal projections or assist projections for players. Feel free to have a look at Fantasy Football Hub. The link is in the description below if you want to have a look at it. Starting from the sort of 4.5 position, I don't really think we have any interesting picks, to be quite honest. There have been a lack of transfer activity from Crystal Palace in terms of, replacements to Elise per se. Now, of course, Kamada has been signed, but positionally speaking, I think Frank has a pretty good chance of actually getting decent minutes within the season, and he's definitely a pick that I think is quite interesting early doors. As far as, let's say, the 5.0 position, I think Rodgers is just a standout pick. The only issue I would say about the 5.0 position is a lot of people are going for Rodgers in certain types of drafts, right? Whether you're going for a Haaland draft, a Haaland plus Salah draft, a lot of drafts incorporate Rodgers, and for the fair point that he will look like a budget enabler. And I think the only concern, of course, is that if we think that his minutes will change at any one point, getting out of Rodgers is a little bit more difficult. So sometimes if you're going for Rodgers anyways, I do think that you still need some security, maybe in a draft where you go for 0.5 in the bank to start with game week 1. Team are more so competing for that left wing spot than, let's say, taking minutes away from Semenyo. So using that as context, I quite like Semenyo for his minutes. I also like the fact that his NPXG is really good. His shots on target metrics are also really nice. That really helps with the bonus additions this season. And of course, assisted goals will help him as well. When you look at some of the other players within this sort of graphic, he's a little bit more expected goal dominant compared to some of the others here who are a little bit more expected assist dominant. And that's because of set pieces and the big difference there. For example, when you look at Hudson-Odoi, he actually pales a little bit in comparison versus Semenyo, right? Less expected goals per 90, which is why I'm not that high on him despite the fixtures are really, really good, and I can see he's in a lot of drafts already. Andreas Pereira is similar to Semenyo, where I would say Fulham's fixtures are probably a touch better, but probably very close to Bournemouth anyways, and he's a little bit more expected assist dominant because of the set pieces. But you can also argue that there's probably less of a volatility with Andreas Pereira. He is someone who definitely plays around 75, 78 rotate minutes per game. He's not someone who's fit enough, in my opinion, to play 90 minutes. You always tend to see the manager try to sub him off at around that time because he's not seen as someone who can actually play the full 90, whereas someone like Willian, before he left the club, was actually more consistently playing 90 minutes when he started. So that's the flip side with Andres Pereira. When we're looking at the per 90 stats, you kind of have to nerf them down a little bit, maybe by a ratio of 75 or 78 over 90, and sort of evaluate him from that standpoint. So I'm not that keen on him either. But for this price point, you still have a lot of good picks that are interesting. Kamada, of course, is the new signing for Crystal Palace, and he's interesting if he can revert back to the sort of positioning that he had in Eintracht Frankfurt. Now, if you look at his positioning in Lazio, his underlying stats in Lazio, they're very poor. But what I will say is there is a nice asterisk around Kamada where if you look at his seasons in the Bundesliga, he was clearly being utilized in a very different role, and he was a much more consistent attacker going back 2 years, right? And if you go back for the 3-4 years that he played there quite consistently and got some really nice numbers. So I think he is someone that I can definitely project to have a little bit more of an expansive role, but you also have to contextualize that Crystal Palace are still not exactly one of the greatest attacking teams in the league. And of course, the Premier League is a lot tougher. So something to say there. Elanga, I think his minutes sort of tailed off at the end of last season. And for that reason, I would still prefer Hudson-Odoi, even though Hudson-Odoi's underlying stats are that much worse than Elanga. If you're really keen into jumping on to a Nottingham Forest 5.5 mid, I still think ultimately I'd prefer a Morgan Gibbs-White, but I can understand people liking Elanga and, of course, the appeal of such great underlying stats. The minutes are just not there for me. As far as the 6.5 territory, we have no 6.0 mids that are really interesting, so we just jump straight into 6.5, and that's a little bit of a price jump, and clearly, of course, that's a break point in some people's drafts, so you do have to pay attention to that. A lot of people have jumped onto Nkunku, so I won't talk too much about him. It's very clear, of course, that he has one bad game, and then after that, Chelsea have a clean run. And if he's anywhere close to being a nailed starter, I think he's just an amazing pick. When you look at some of the baselines in previous years, when you look at the Bundesliga, incredible. Not just goals and assists, but the underlying stats as well. With Nkunku, another point that we can mention is there was a bit of small sample size last season with his numbers. So when you look at the expected goals, the expected assists, I would say you can expect that to change. I'm not saying that he will 100% play as a striker for the team. I still think that even as a left winger, he can be very, very interesting. And I have no qualms really with having him on the cheat sheet as a top option. I still think that this logic applies to Bailey and applies to Brennan Johnson. These are both two players, when you look at this entire cheat sheet, that actually have incredible numbers as well, right? Bailey, really, really good at expected assisted goals, clearly showing that he's a very creative player. Takes some set pieces as well. Brennan Johnson, just amazing as an open play threat overall. Really, really good expected goals numbers as well. The issue with Brennan Johnson last season was conversion, right? He was very, very poor at converting, and you can even argue that he was the Darwin of the midfield, if you want to sort of criticize, I suppose, someone like Darwin like that. So there is a lot of upside to someone like Brennan Johnson, because what I tend to say with the expected assisted goals is, you know, converting those chances isn't up to you. So even though you're a poor finisher, if you're actually very creative, that's okay, because you've got players like Son or even Madison or Richarlison who are converting your chances as opposed to yourself. Now, in terms of expected goals conversion, he's a bit of a young player, so I would say the jury's still out on whether he's, you know, truly just an awful finisher or whether that was just an awful season of finishing. So I still think I'm quite high into him, and the fixtures for Tottenham, of course, start really well and then become progressively a bit tougher. With players like, let's say, Bailey, you'd argue that Game Week 2 is that sort of issue with the Aston Villa fixtures. After that, and even before that, arguably with West Ham, they're just really good games. So Bailey, definitely an interesting pick, and Gibbs White basically has a clean run here with a little bit of a weaker team, the set piece taker. So he's always that sort of pick where I would say he's a high floor pick. There's nothing really that can go wrong with him. His minutes are going to be a lot better. He hasn't really shown a history of sort of being injury prone like a Bailey, like an Nkunku, and, you know, no sort of big glaring underperformance of finishing like Brennan Johnson. The stats, of course, are a little bit worse, and some of the things that are nice is that he does take set pieces. One thing that I'll mention too is when it comes to accumulation bonus, just simply racking up the amount of chances created is very helpful for that. It's not only just the expected assisted goals sort of metric that really reflects how creative a player is. So if you take more set pieces, which Gibbs White actually does, that's very, very helpful to his accumulation of points in FPL. The other players that I have in the yellow bracket, so the tier right below, are Garnacho and Barnes. And I think part of this is because, for me, between Barnes and Gordon, I would still say that Barnes, of course, has amazing underlying stats, but Barnes does have amazing underlying stats, but you still have to contextualize that he has less minutes than someone like Gordon. Gordon can play a multitude of roles for the team. We've seen him play center forward before. He can also move on to the right-hand side if, let's say, they ever choose to incorporate a left winger into the team, whereas Barnes clearly is someone who can very well start the season, but isn't necessarily guaranteed to play 90 minutes a game. So when you look at the sort of per 90 numbers, yes, of course, while they're slightly better than Gordon's, you do need to take the minutes into account. Another thing I'll probably say is that you also still, once again, run the risk of the minutes being worse progressively, and then he becomes a transfer out, more so than, let's say, someone like Gordon, who you wouldn't be worried about transferring out until effectively game week 6. The same sort of applies to Garnacho, where I clearly think that he was nailed close to the end of last season, and if we were to talk pecking order, I think he's still ahead of Rashford. The issue comes where Antony is still at the club. You have Sancho coming back into the team, and you have Amad Diallo, who sort of Ten Hag has already signaled as someone who can get involved and be a big part of the season as a growing player. And so with the amount of depth that United have on the wings, I think Rashford benefits a little bit from being able to play centre forward potentially at times, although now they kind of have two. Whereas Garnacho, you're sort of looking at him being a winger. Sometimes he would also cover Rashford minutes when he was out, which would mean that Garnacho would move to the left and then Antony would therefore move to the right. Now, with the amount of depth in the team, I do think that his minutes could be a little bit less, which is why I'm not that high on Garnacho, given that his open play numbers are not stellar by any means. In the next tier, we have differentials, and Sobo and Kudus will obviously stick out as the biggest differentials. I think Kudus, we've always seen he is the sort of quintessential eye test player, right? He can do miraculous things. We've seen it in the World Cup. We've seen it even within the last game week of last season, and obviously through his time with Ajax too. But the underlying stats were poor last season, and that's reflective of most of the West Ham team in general. So with the change in manager, the question mark, I suppose, is whether we think that they'll improve as an attack, and I think they certainly will. But the fixtures are also pretty tough to begin with, right? You've got Aston Villa and Man City already sandwiched within the first 3 fixtures. The easier fixture, quote unquote, is actually Crystal Palace away, which is also just another extremely tough fixture, given that they're a very strong defense. So I think for West Ham players, it's more a case of see what Julian Lopetegui tries to install, see how things go at the start of the season, and then we can jump on to Kudus as a pick later down the line when the fixtures get better. And the same applies with someone like Jared Bowen. On top of that, with players like Sobo, it's really positionally dependent, right? He can be a little bit more of a boring centre mid once again, or he can be the 10 of the system under slot. I would not be able to 100% at this moment in time say that that's the case. So I'm not going to just go for a pick and suddenly expect a huge inflation in terms of how interesting he could be as an FPL asset until I see a bit more from preseason. He actually benefits a lot from the bonus rating changes, but for me, he's once again another high floor, lower ceiling pick where clearly he benefits from fouls drawn. He is someone who will always give you 90 minutes a game. But look at the open play underlying stats. They're definitely a little bit worse than most. And so, I'd be much more comfortable going with a little bit more of an open play attacker anyways and trying to tap into a little bit of that upside as opposed to starting the season with Bruno Guimaraes. And that's sort of my thoughts there. As far as the 7.0 position, I think that's actually quite boring right now. It seems to be as the king. Yes, we've seen some Man City leaks right now, and that could very well change, how we value Eze. That could very well drop Eze's value because, once again, you're losing potentially more set pieces. You're losing penalties. You're probably also losing a lot of minutes, although your underlying stats could fly up as a result of joining a much stronger attacking team. So those are my thoughts on Eze right now. And right now, of course, if he's still a Crystal Palace player as he is, he just seems like an absolutely set and forget pick for the game, right? So many things are going his direction. With Olise out, you have no more questions about pen share. You have no questions about potentially even set pieces. And that just makes him the main talisman for Crystal Palace and the main avenue to FPL points outside of Mateta, and that's why I love Eze as a pick. The other picks are all a little bit dicey based on the minutes, right? Trossard, Rashford, Martinelli, their value is very much tied to the minutes that they play, and for now, even though we've seen incredible seasons from Rashford, I think Rashford and Martinelli with less minutes are definitely very dull picks. Trossard has been the most interesting because close to the end of the season, he did close out most games as a starter, but is it really worth gambling with the minutes? I'm not so sure. I probably would still avoid Trossard for the time being. It's not really how I like to play FPL. I personally prefer to have more minutes, unless it's, for example, a case where you're absolutely sure that Trossard's going to play 75 minutes per game. But that very rarely happens. I think Richarlison was a good example of that last season, where during the middle part of the season, he was very clearly playing 75 to 90 minutes a game and starting most games. However, with Trossard, you can very well see within a few game weeks where Martinelli could start a game over him or vice versa. So that's why I don't really like the two. Rashford, I think, once again, you have to see, first of all, an improvement from Man United as an overall attacking team. You've got Garnacho, who probably is a little bit ahead of him in the pecking order, cheaper. And whilst Rashford is someone that we've previously seen be a great player, particularly on the underlyings as well, and the output, we just have to, I'd rather just wait and see than jump on Rashford early doors. With Mbeumo, it's really Tony dependent for me, because once Tony leaves the club, you become the penalty taker of the team, and you become closer to that Eze territory of sort of being the main avenue to your team's points. Another thing going against Mbeumo, I would say, for the early start of the season is simply the fixtures that Brentford have. You've got Crystal Palace, Liverpool, and even Man City within the front five. Not exactly keen on those fixtures in general, and that's why I'm probably not going to start the season with Mbeumo, unlike we did in the previous. As far as 7.5, Gordon is still screaming out as the best pick for me. Yes, the underlying stats are not anywhere near amazing for Gordon, but the value tied towards Gordon is always the fact that he plays the minutes that he does, right? He's almost close to 90 minutes per game when he's actually fit and can play a multitude of roles from the team. And another asterisk, I suppose, is if Trippier leaves the club, which seems to be something that is close to happening, then Trippier will actually default these set pieces to Gordon, which actually just improves Gordon as an asset that much more. It makes him that much more creative, prone to getting assists now, but then also the chances created element of the game, the fouls drawn element of the game, and the shots on target element of the game. All these BPS changes will make Gordon an even better pick. And so that's why I think Gordon, starting the season with the way that Newcastle's fixtures are lined up, is just an amazing pick. Maddison is someone I expect to start this season for Tottenham. The issue last season was he was starting to lose minutes, starting to lose form, and I do think that game week 1, a new season, a preseason even, is going to reset that for Maddison. Hopefully that will be a huge boost to sort of his value in the game. I saw a little bit of the sort of above average bonus sort of recast pod, and Maddison clearly benefited a lot, even after taking into account Richarlison's positional change. And it clearly shows you that as the person who's on a lot of set pieces, on a lot of key actions for the team, he will benefit for Tottenham. And it's a case of whether you trust, I suppose, Maddison's minutes and his ability to bounce back from a very poor second half of the season last year on. I do think it's plausible, but would I start with Maddison or Gordon? Once again, I'd probably go back to Gordon just because of the guarantees there. And ultimately, still better fixtures. With Diogo Jota and Bowen, it's an interesting one where West Ham, unfortunately, just have really poor fixtures to start with me. So whilst Bowen is definitely a great pick, and I think he can even maybe step up and take a level up with Koulibaly and Lopetegui, I want to wait for the fixtures to be a bit better before I move into Bowen. With Diogo Jota, he's always been a pick where, with the quality of finishing that he possesses, with the underlying stats that he usually accumulates as a center forward at times or even as a substitute, the per 90 numbers are always going to be very, very enthralling, right? But we need to make sure the minutes are correct. I tend to think that we could see a lot more minutes from Diogo Jota this season, and that maybe Sop could have a preference for him, but we still need to wait and see. Clearly, when you look at the GA sort of per 90, he does put out a lot more output than, let's say, a Darwin or a Luis Diaz, as long as he plays football. But does he get those minutes? I'm not so sure, which is why he's a yellow pick. With Luis Diaz, I tend to think that he could maybe be the one who loses out a little bit more compared to under Slot versus Klopp, right? Where we know that Gakpo could very well move a little bit more towards the left this season and take more minutes away from Luis Diaz, whereas under Klopp, it seemed to be that Jota, that Gakpo and Darwin were fighting for a lot more minutes, and Luis Diaz still actually was able to retain a lot of minutes. Part of that is also form, right? Luis Diaz played very well until I would say the big slide in April, and unfortunately, of course, all sorts of forwards and attackers within that team were diminished. Diogo Jota got re-injured as well. But yeah, Luis Diaz's underlying stats took a bit of a leap last season, and that was a huge improvement. But I wonder whether his minutes will be that good to start the season with the change in manager, and that's sort of why I have Luis Diaz a little bit lower compared to, let's say, Jota. As far as the sort of premium players, right, we're stepping into the sub-premium category. Odegaard and Bruno, I think, are both exceptional. These are both players that are very interesting and different to, let's say, an Anthony Gordon, who's a little bit more, coming out of open play. and has value tied to a lot of the expected goals. These two players are a little bit lower on expected goals, much higher on expected assisted goals, but also have access to quite a few set pieces. Odegaard, also as the central hub of the team within open play, does a lot of actions that actually lead towards the accumulation of BPS. And that additional bonus points will always benefit when Odegaard, once he finally gets an assist in a game or a goal. So that is almost like a compounding effect with Odegaard. With Bruno, we know that he has absolutely everything. Sometimes he likes to donate penalties away to Rashford, which is not so nice. I experienced that once last season and was pretty frustrated. But that's a huge boost, and he has set pieces and free kicks. So when you're looking at corners and free kicks, all that accumulates, once again, more chances of assisting people, but also more chances of getting and being the number one option for bonus within the team. So that's really, really nice for Bruno. I like him very much for that reason. As far as the next tier, and sorry, going back to Odegaard and Bruno, I think what's nice about these two players compared to a lot of the other players that we've discussed, like a Trossard, like a Rashford, like a Luis Diaz, like a Jota, is that their minutes are absolutely guaranteed. Bruno will probably play every single minute when possible, whereas Odegaard, at the worst case, he's an 81-minute sub, but realistically, you're looking at an 87, 88-minute sub for most situations. Otherwise, he's going to be playing the full game. And I think that's a lot of the value tied to these sorts of players, where we shouldn't always just look at the per 90s, right? Someone like Bailey will play naturally less minutes. He sometimes will get subbed off at 75 minutes regardless, even if he's going to start every single game. With Odegaard and Bruno, you get the full guarantee, and that sometimes is very, very beneficial to sort of evaluating FPL players, because you don't want to get just purely tempted into the upside, because you also need to be 100% mindful of the downside. These two players in specific don't really have that. As far as the 9.5 and above players, I've put KDB as a bit of a yellow, because I tend to think, at his sort of age, it might be the case that he plays less minutes anyways. We tend to see, for example, KDB now in most games under Pep, where he plays maybe 75 minutes a game and then he gets subbed off. And I think that's very plausible, even though at the start of the season, you'd expect better minutes. One thing that's nice is that Pep Guardiola has pretty much shut out all the sort of Saudi rumors. I do tend to think that the younger players, even though they were involved within international duty for a lot longer than KDB, will still be able to be available in Game Week 1. We heard Arteta mention that Saka should be back for Game Week 1. I haven't heard Pep talk about Foden explicitly, but for Son and Palmer, we also expect these players to come back. Son, of course, a little bit of a veteran player now as well. With Son, I've put an asterisk, because I tend to think that there are two versions of Son. The left wing version of Son and the center forward version of Son. As an FPL asset, you do prefer the center forward version of Son. A lot of people might disagree. They might think that Son's a better player at left wing. And I think there's a difference between being a better player in terms of, let's say, Tottenham's overall results versus being a better player for FPL. For FPL, when you look at the underlying stats, Son is clearly better as a center forward. His expected goals shoots up a lot higher than 0.32, as you can see here. Whereas when he's a left winger, he's a lot more dull and a lot more flat as an asset. So it comes down to ultimately what you think about Son as a pick. Of course, the expected assisted goals will also change based on position. He's a bit more creative on the left, a little bit less creative in the middle. I prefer, of course, expected goals over expected assists, and for that reason, I would like to start the season, if possible, with Son if I knew he was going to be a center forward. Richarlison seemingly has joined up with the team for the training camp, the preseason so far, so it might be the case that we see Son revert back to left wing, which at that point, I'd probably class him as a bit of a yellow pick. Otherwise, I think if he starts the season as center forward, he's definitely a green pick for me, and that's sort of the dual-edged blade with Son. With Foden, I just think he became such a crucial player last season. I would be a little bit shocked if he didn't start the season in very much the same way, or with the same level, or without the same level of importance. So I'm projecting very much similar things for Foden. That's why I think he's still a very interesting pick, and that's pretty much it between Foden, Saka, and KDB. With Palmer, ultimately, I think a lot of people, recognize him as basically the crown prince of last season, or even the king, really. And there's not much to say about Palmer other than the fact that these underlying stats, especially when you consider that they're non-penalty, are amazing. The fact that he started taking more set pieces close to the end of the season, such as free kicks, for example, which he already very clearly is good at. I think I remember even seeing one of the sort of free kick goals live versus Tottenham, which was lovely. Or rather, I think it hit the crossbar, and Jackson, I think, followed up with a goal, and then he actually scored from a direct free kick later on. But in general, all these things are amazing for Palmer. And yes, whilst there's a change in manager, I tend to believe that a change of manager is not really going to impact an individual player's level of performance as much as we'd really think. it would be odd for me to think that Enzo would dramatically change how Palmer is important to this team. And for that reason, I think Palmer will be absolutely fine this season. The question, of course, is whether you want to spend that much money at the start of the season for someone like Palmer if you're probably going to captain Salah, let's say, every time over him. And that's the question that I've been asking myself too when I look at players like anything above basically 9 million in price. So when I have Foden, for example, within my own draft, the question I suppose is, if I really plan to captain Salah anyways between game weeks 1 to 6, is there really a need to go for some of these players priced between 9.5 to 10.5? Because part of the value attached to some of these players is that they can be a captaincy option at a time. And I think that's why FPL have priced them in this sort of way. So something to think about is definitely how you plan to captain certain players, and whether Haaland, of course, is a part of this conundrum. But a very interesting pricing created by FPL for the 24-25 season. I think it makes it extremely interesting now in terms of picks. I think we have a lot of variety too, particularly in the 6.5 million position. And I'm sure some people will also be looking at some of the 9.5 to 10 million players as well, because I can't really see where you can go dramatically wrong by picking, let's say, Saka over Foden, or Foden over Son, or Son over Palmer. So a lot of people will have different opinions on these sorts of players. I have to say the fixture runs are quite similar when you contextualize the strength of the teams respectively, and it really comes down to personal preference as well. I think once again, we have a lot of options, and I think that's the beauty of this season start compared to the season previous, where I felt like there was a lot more restriction around the positions. So that's the Game Week 1 Midfielders cheat sheet. A little bit of a long one. Let me know what you guys think. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Take care and goodbye.